Rod Serling was a paratrooper, a chain smoker, an Emmy winner, and a man the television industry spent most of the 1950s trying to silence. They handed him a cloaking device instead. From 1959 to 1964, in black and white on a budget that could not afford mistakes, he built something that the people trying to stop him never saw coming. 20 facts about the show that rewired American fear. Number 20. Censors accidentally built the show. Before the Twilight Zone, Serling was already one of the most decorated writers in American television, winning Emmy after Emmy for hard-hitting dramas that confronted racism, war, and systemic injustice with a directness that made sponsors deeply uncomfortable. The sponsors mattered enormously. In the 1950s, cigarette companies and appliance manufacturers buying advertising time had genuine creative authority over the content surrounding their products, and they exercised it ruthlessly. If a Serling script made audiences in certain parts of the country uneasy, particularly the South, particularly about race, the sponsor would gut it. His breaking point came with a teleplay inspired by the real murder of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old black boy from Chicago kidnapped and killed in Mississippi in 1955. By the time the network and sponsors had finished with it, the victim was no longer black, the setting was no longer the South, and the word lynching had been removed entirely. A searing indictment of racial violence had been hollowed into nothing. That was when Serling understood something the networks never anticipated. If he set his stories on distant planets, if he made the villain a robot, if he turned prejudice into a supernatural curse, the censors stopped paying attention. They thought they were approving harmless science fiction. He was smuggling McCarthyism, racism, nuclear paranoia, and every subject they had silenced him for directly into American living rooms. The people trying to stop him handed him the method that made him immortal. Number 19. The script. CBS buried. In 1957, Serling wrote a script called The Time Element. It had everything the Twilight Zone would become: time travel, creeping dread, and a twist that lodges in the brain and refuses to leave. A man visits a psychiatrist because he keeps having the same nightmare. He is in Honolulu on December 6, 1941, the day before Pearl Harbor, and every night the dream lasts longer and feels more real. CBS executives read it, hated it, bought it to shelve it, and paid Serling off. Too bleak, too confusing, too strange for a television audience. The script went into a drawer. A year later, producer Burt Granett was digging through CBS's dead pile looking for material for Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse. He found it. Desi Arnaz, yes, that Desi Arnaz, saw something in the script that the network had actively decided not to see, and he aired The Time Element on November 24, 1958. The CBS mailroom was buried. Thousands of letters poured in from viewers who said it haunted them. They loved the exact twist that network executives had decided audiences were too unsophisticated to follow. CBS called Serling. They gave him a green light. The show they had tried to discard gave birth to the show that would outlast all of them. Number 18. The War That Built the Zone. Rod Serling enlisted in the Army in 1943 and was assigned to the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He jumped into the Philippines and fought through some of the most brutal close-quarters combat of the Pacific Campaign. He was not yet 20 years old. What he witnessed never left him. He watched a close friend killed by a random piece of shrapnel. He saw American soldiers behave with the same savage cruelty they had been sent overseas to defeat. He saw how quickly the line between the civilized and the monstrous could disappear. He came home with a Bronze Star, a Presidential Unit citation, and what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, though in 1945 no one had a name for it and no infrastructure to treat it. He channeled it into writing instead. The Twilight Zone's recurring preoccupations, the ordinary man destroyed by forces beyond his control, the thin membrane separating civilization from barbarism, the soldier undone not by the enemy, but by the mechanisms of his own side, were not imaginative exercises. Every episode Serling set in a war or an authoritarian state was an attempt to translate something real that television was not supposed to say directly. The censors thought he was writing science fiction. He was writing about the Philippines. Number 17. The narrator nobody wanted. When the Twilight Zone was being developed, Serling had no intention of appearing on camera. He wanted something theatrical, a voice of God presence that would lend the show authority. He approached Orson Welles, the man who had caused a nationwide panic in 1938 with his War of the Worlds broadcast, and who seemed on paper like the ideal narrator for a show about the strangeness at the edges of ordinary life. Welles wanted too much money. Other candidates sounded too polished, too much like horror movie announcers, too eager to signal that the audience was being unsettled. As the first season deadline pressed in, options closed off one by one, and Serling stepped in front of the camera himself, convinced it was a temporary solution and privately certain he would look ridiculous. He thought he was too stiff, his voice too clipped and precise. What he actually brought was something no professional announcer could have manufactured: the quality of a man who had already been through something, who was explaining not to frighten you, but because he felt it was his obligation. The cigarette-curling smoke into the frame, the calm that felt like restraint rather than composure. These were not choices. They were just Serling, barely performing at all. By season 2, audiences were watching partly to see where he would stand, what he would say, how the particular quality of his attention would frame what was coming. The narrator nobody wanted became the soul of the show. Number 16. The theme song was an accident. For the first season, Serling hired Bernard Herrmann, Alfred Hitchcock's composer, the man responsible for the shrieking strings in Psycho, to write the score. Herrmann's original theme was orchestral, moody, and sophisticated. It was elegant and entirely wrong. It didn't crawl under your skin. It didn't follow you home. When season 2 arrived, the producers turned to French composer Marius Constant, who had recorded a library of short experimental music cues, pieces not written for any specific project, just cataloged and available. The producers pulled 2 of them, Étrange number 3 and Milieu number 2. They stitched them together without consulting Constant, without designing them for the purpose, without any particular intention beyond finding something that felt alien. 4 electric guitar notes, a nervous bongo rhythm underneath, the seams showing. It became one of the most recognizable pieces of audio in television history. The 4 notes that mean something is about to go badly wrong for someone who thought they understood where they were. Constant was living in France. He had no idea the show existed, never watched it while it was airing, and only understood what had happened years later when the royalty checks began arriving in unusual quantities. The most unsettling sound in American television was assembled by accident from leftover material by people who didn't know what they were making. Number 15. Before they were legends. The Twilight Zone didn't hire stars. It hired people who were about to become them, put them in impossible scenarios with minimal preparation, and found out who survived the pressure. William Shatner appeared twice. In Nick of Time, he was psychologically undone by a fortune-telling napkin dispenser. In Nightmare at 20,000 feet, trapped on an aircraft in the dark, he saw something on the wing and came apart completely. A performance so committed in its breakdown that it has been parodied for 60 years without losing its original charge. Burt Reynolds appeared in The Bard, playing an actor giving a pitch-perfect parody of Marlon Brando's method approach, the mumbling, the slouching, the affected intensity, with a wink that proved Reynolds had always understood exactly what he was doing, even when everyone else was still catching up. Robert Redford played Death in Nothing in the Dark, calm, kind, radiant, flipping everything the audience expected from the concept, selling the episode's emotional weight so effortlessly that it remains one of the most affecting half hours in the series. Burgess Meredith appeared 4 times, more than any other lead actor. He became Serling's definitive everyman. Thoughtful, decent, fragile, and reliably crushed by the universe just as he had found something worth protecting. Number 14. The Child Who Frightened Parents. In November 1961, The Twilight Zone aired It's a Good Life. 6-year-old Anthony Fremont has the power to read minds, reshape reality, and banish to the cornfield anything or anyone who displeases him. The town of Peaksville exists entirely for Anthony's entertainment, its surviving population walking an endless tightrope of performed contentment, unable to think anything negative within range of a child who will know. Billy Mumy played Anthony. He was 7 years old. Mumy delivered one of the most genuinely unsettling child performances in American television history, not because he played Anthony as monstrous, but because he played him as entirely sincere, a child with no framework for understanding that other people's suffering was real. The horror was not cruelty. It was the absence of whatever would have made cruelty meaningful. CBS received letters from parents whose children had been frightened not by the episode's events but by Mumy specifically, by something in his stillness on screen that read as genuinely wrong. Mumy went on to play Will Robinson in Lost in Space and became one of the most recognizable child actors in American television history. He has said in interviews that It's a Good Life is still what strangers stop him to discuss 60 years on. Number 13. The 8-Day Miracle. Most prestige drama productions in the early 1960s took 10 to 12 days to film a single episode. A typical Twilight Zone episode moved from initial concept to broadcast in approximately 8 days total, 1 or 2 in pre-production, 3 to 5 of 12 to 14-hour shoot days, and a single day of post-production editing, scoring, and recording Serling's narration, often happening simultaneously with the final edit. Because Serling was writing nearly 2/3 of the episodes himself, scripts frequently arrived the day before filming. Guest actors showed up to sets they had never seen, handed dense philosophical monologues with no table reads and no extended rehearsal. They learned their lines in the makeup chair. The pace inadvertently protected the show from the network. By the time CBS decided an ending was too dark or too ambiguous, the episode was already in transit. Serling joked about being the oldest young man in Hollywood. When The Twilight Zone ended in 1964, he was 39. He looked a decade older. Number 12. Where the name came from. The phrase Twilight Zone did not originate with Rod Serling. Among military and commercial pilots, it described something specific and dangerous, the condition during landing at dusk, dawn, or in heavy fog when the horizon disappears entirely, when sky and ground blur into the same gray and the inner ear lies. Pilots who lost the horizon felt certain they were climbing when they were diving. The disorientation was total. Serling had lived this. As a paratrooper in World War II, he had sat inside transport aircraft piloted by men for whom the Twilight Zone was not a metaphor, but a technical emergency. He understood something most horror writers missed. That genuine fear lives not in total darkness, but in the moment when you think you understand what you're looking at, and you are wrong. He experimented with variations, the zone of twilight among others, before landing on the phrase that carried both the scientific and the poetic, the authoritative and the mysterious. Within years, it had escaped the show entirely. When something inexplicable happened, people didn't say it was strange. They hummed 4 notes. The phrase became cultural shorthand so complete that people who have never watched a single episode use it without knowing where it came from. Number 11. The episode that predicted its star's near death. The Purple Testament aired on February 12, 1960. William Reynolds played a World War II lieutenant who develops the ability to see a faint glow on the faces of men who are about to die. He tracks it, he reports it, and then, examining himself in a mirror, he sees the glow on his own face. The episode doesn't show his death. A distant explosion. Silence. Serling understood that what the audience imagines is always worse than what he could show. On the same day The Purple Testament aired, William Reynolds and director Richard Bear boarded a small aircraft together. It crashed. Both men survived. An episode about a soldier who sees his own death broadcast on the day its star nearly died in real life. Reynolds never made much of it publicly. He lived to be 90, had a long and successful television career, and treated the coincidence with the composure of a man who had learned not to look too directly at certain things. Serling built The Twilight Zone on precisely this kind of moment, the story that reaches out of the frame and touches the world that produced it. Number 10. The show that borrowed everything. The Twilight Zone jumped from ancient Rome to the distant future to 1950s suburban America in consecutive weeks. The production could not afford to build any of it. The neighborhood in The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street was filmed on Universal's Courthouse Square backlot, the same set that would later become Hill Valley in Back to the Future. Spacesuits were repurposed U.S. Navy pressure suits or props left from 1950s B-movies. Roman tunics came from MGM's stock of biblical epics. High-tech computer consoles were wooden boxes with Christmas lights attached. Cinematographer George T. Clemens lit those borrowed sets like film noir masterpieces, and the high-contrast black and white hid every seam. A $50,000 television episode looked like $1 million film. Then, CBS decided it was spending too much and switched 6 episodes to videotape, the same technology used for game shows and the evening news. The moment those episodes aired, something broke. Film had depth and shadow and texture. Videotape was flat and bright and harsh, the visual quality of a supermarket promotion. CBS reversed the decision and never mentioned it again. For years, those videotape episodes were excluded from syndication packages. Even children watching late-night reruns could feel the wrongness without being able to name it. The Twilight Zone didn't need production value, it needed the right shadows. Number 9. The most expensive shot in the series. A typical Twilight Zone episode cost approximately $50,000. The anthology format meant starting completely from scratch each week with no standing cast, no standing location. The Odyssey of Flight 33 needed more. A commercial Boeing 707 punches through the time barrier, first back to the age of dinosaurs, then forward to 1939 New York City. On paper, it was impossible for a half-hour television production. In practice, it required one shot that would become the single most expensive piece of footage the show ever produced. A stop-motion brontosaurus, borrowed from the 1960 B-movie Dinosaurus. That brief prehistoric sequence cost approximately $2,500. On a show running on the financial equivalent of fumes, it triggered formal scrutiny from CBS Business Affairs, an uncomfortable experience for a production that had been quietly surviving on ingenuity and borrowed props. It is not the dinosaur that people remember from that episode. It is the cockpit, the instruments, the faces of the crew in the moment they understand where they are. The Twilight Zone's most beloved episodes were never the expensive ones. They had ideas, and ideas are what people carry for decades. Number 8. The One-Man Factory. Rod Serling wrote nearly 2/3 of the Twilight Zone's episodes himself, pacing his office with a cigarette in one hand and a dictation recorder in the other, talking himself through stories around the clock. Every line, every pause, every philosophical aside. He wasn't entirely alone. Richard Matheson brought the nightmares. Nightmare at 20,000 feet, Little Girl Lost, stories that worked through pure escalating dread. Charles Beaumont brought dark humor and grotesque invention. The Howling Man, Perchance to Dream, a sensibility that complemented Serling's moral architecture without duplicating it. Together, the three men wrote approximately 80% of the episodes. There was no network committee refining the strangeness out of the material, but it came at a cost that is genuinely difficult to look at. By season 5, Serling was creatively exhausted, beginning by his own admission to repeat himself, and sold his share of the show back to CBS. Charles Beaumont fell ill with what was likely Pick's disease. a form of early-onset dementia that aged him catastrophically. Friends ghost-wrote his final scripts so he could continue receiving payment for work he could no longer do. Beaumont died in 1967. He was 38. The show's darkness had reached through the frame and found him. Number 7. The Twist That Escaped Television. To Serve Man aired on March 2, 1962. Aliens arrive on Earth offering technology and universal peace. A government codebreaker works to translate the title of the alien visitor's primary text. It is a cookbook. The twist is not complicated. It works entirely on the delayed recognition of something that was in plain sight the whole time. It became, by reasonable measure, the most culturally embedded twist ending in American television history, appearing in The Simpsons, in political commentary, in every medium that has ever needed shorthand for the moment when assistance reveals itself as predation. People who have never watched the episode know what the cookbook means. The original story is a 1950 short fiction by Damon Knight, who received minimal compensation under the standard licensing arrangements of the era. Arrangements that were, as he understood them, instructive about the relationship between creative origination and industrial profit. Knight went on to become one of the most influential figures in science fiction, a founder of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, and a tireless advocate for writers' rights. The cookbook is still in print. Number 6. The Oscar the show didn't make. In 1964, the Twilight Zone licensed a French short film rather than producing an original episode. Director Robert Enrico had already made a definitive adaptation of Ambrose Bierce's 1890 story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, for a fraction of what a standard episode would cost. CBS acquired the rights, added Serling's opening and closing narration, and aired it unchanged. The difference was impossible to miss. This was not shot like television. The camera moved with a fluid cinematic grace that made the standard visual language of the show look rigid by comparison. Almost no dialogue, no moral articulated, no speech. Wind in trees, footsteps, breathing, silence carrying the weight of the narrative. And then the ending, the revelation that the entire desperate escape had unfolded in the split second before the character's death, landed with an impact that the film had earned so completely it felt inevitable and impossible at once. The film had already won the Academy Award for Best Live-Action Short before The Twilight Zone aired it. Because of licensing restrictions, it circulated rarely in syndication for years, becoming the show's ghost episode, something older siblings swore they had seen. The only Twilight Zone episode connected to an Academy Award is the one Rod Serling did not write. Number 5. The Fortune He Gave Away. When The Twilight Zone ended in 1964, CBS approached Serling with an offer, 40% of the property for a lump sum of approximately $600,000. To a television writer in 1964, this was significant money, the kind of payment that meant he could stop worrying. He took it. He figured the show would date badly. Black and white morality plays about science fiction scenarios produced at the tail end of an era already turning toward color and spectacle. Within a few years, every independent television station in America needed content to fill its late-night hours, and The Twilight Zone was perfect. Compact, standalone, intelligent, endlessly rewatchable. Paranoia, greed, the cruelty of small communities, the loneliness of individuals who think differently from everyone around them. These things do not date. The show played. Night after night, year after year, decade after decade. Had Serling kept that 40% stake, his estate would almost certainly have earned hundreds of millions in royalties over the following 60 years. Instead, he spent the rest of his life working, writing, teaching, hosting Night Gallery, a show he had little creative control over and resented publicly until his death in 1975 at the age of 50. His wife Carol spent the decades after his death ensuring that his name remained synonymous with the show, that the cultural credit attached to his work stayed attached to him, even as the financial returns went elsewhere. The man who spent 5 years warning audiences about ironic reversals of fate lived one. Number 4. Disney brought him back. In 1994, Disney opened the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror, a freefall attraction built inside a replica of a ruined Hollywood hotel, the most elaborate tribute to a single television property in theme park history. The pre-show features Rod Serling introducing the story. Some of what you hear is Serling's actual voice, drawn from existing 1961 recordings. The gaps were filled by voice actor Mark Silverman, recording into a vintage microphone on an optical track with deliberate noise and hiss added to match the texture of 40-year-old tape. The seams are virtually undetectable. There is also the matter of the cigarette. In the original footage, Serling holds a Chesterfield with the naturalness of a man who has been doing this since adolescence. Disney's no-smoking policy required the Imagineers to digitally erase it. Serling's hand in the pre-show library is frozen in a slightly awkward C shape, the ghost of a habit, the negative space of something that can no longer be seen. Hidden throughout the attraction are objects from specific episodes: the fortune-telling napkin dispenser from Nick of Time, Burgess Meredith's broken glasses from Time Enough at Last, the cookbook from To Serve Man, the trumpet from A Passage for Trumpet. You are not riding an elevator. You are moving through a museum of a particular kind of American dread, assembled by people who understood exactly what they were honoring. Number 3. The camera trick that protected the ending. Eye of the Beholder aired on November 11, 1960. A woman lies in a hospital bed, her face entirely wrapped in bandages, recovering from her 11th surgical attempt at correction. The story follows her nurses and doctors and her desperate hope that this time the procedure will have worked, that this time she will finally look normal. The episode's entire production was constructed around a single problem. The audience could not be allowed to see the faces of anyone in the episode until the precise moment the revelation required it. Director Douglas Hise and cinematographer George T. Clemens shot the entire episode in deep shadow, with faces turned away from camera, with extreme close-ups on hands and instruments and expressions that conveyed everything needed without revealing anything. When the camera finally showed the doctors and nurses clearly, faces the audience had been sitting with for 20 minutes, the revelation that they were the ones who looked monstrous and that the woman in the bandages was beautiful by any standard the audience recognized, landed with an impact that would have been impossible if a single earlier shot had broken the concealment. It is a technical achievement disguised as a moral argument. The lesson and the method are inseparable. You cannot understand what normality means until the camera that has been controlling your information finally shows you what it withheld. It remains one of the most studied episodes in the history of American television production. Number 2. The Day the Show Killed Someone. On July 23, 1982, a film crew working on The Twilight Zone, the movie was shooting a scene for a segment directed by John Landis. Actor Vic Morrow and 2 Vietnamese-American child actors, Mika Din Lay, aged 6, and Renee Shin Yi Chen, aged 7, were wading through a river while a helicopter hovered overhead in the dark. The scene involved explosions. One of the explosions damaged the helicopter's tail rotor. The aircraft came down. Morrow and both children were killed. The children had been hired in violation of California child labor laws, which prohibited minors from working at night or in proximity to pyrotechnics. They had been brought to the set without the required permits. Their parents told only that their children were appearing in a film, not that they would be standing beneath a helicopter during a controlled explosion sequence. John Landis was criminally charged with involuntary manslaughter. He was acquitted. The Twilight Zone. The movie was released in 1983 and receded from the cultural conversation. The franchise survived, producing multiple revivals across subsequent decades. The names Mika Din Lay and Renee Shin Yi Chen do not appear prominently in any of them. Number 1. The Spiral That Never Stopped. In Season 4, Serling replaced the standard static end credits with a hypnotic spinning vortex. Black and white lines rotating into a vanishing point. a visual with no beginning and no end, an image that did not say the story was finished but that you were now somewhere else, somewhere the story continued without you. It was psychological, not aesthetic. The spiral didn't close, it pulled, it reset. It told the audience that the Twilight Zone was not a series of stories that started and stopped, but a condition. One that did not end when the broadcast did, one that followed you out of the room and into your understanding of the world outside. Every element of the show had been working toward this. Serling was not building entertainment. He was building a persistent alteration in how the people watching understood the ordinary. The neighbor who might not be human. The community that turns on itself. The institution that advertises your welfare while serving its own. The ordinary morning that is not the world you left the night before. The show is 65 years old. It does not feel like a historical artifact. It feels like a description of the present tense, which is either a credit to Serling's intelligence or a comment on how little the underlying conditions have changed. Possibly both. The monsters wear different faces. The technology updates. The dread is the same dread. Somewhere tonight, someone who has never seen it before is watching Time Enough at Last for the first time, or The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, or Eye of the Beholder. They are about to feel exactly what 60 years of audiences felt in the same moment. Not because the show is clever, though it is, but because the things it was about were never fictional. The spiral is still spinning. It was never going to stop.
Wow, that was weird.